Since we're taking into account this shift in the mood that takes place after Judas leaves the company, then we're more able to recognize the significance of Jesus' opening words in this chapter, where he says, "Let not your hearts be troubled." Jesus is essentially explaining to us that he bore our trouble so that we wouldn't have to bear trouble alone. Jesus didn't want his disciples to be troubled. This idea of troubled in their heart, you know what it's like. There's in the language that the Bible was written in Greek, this is the word that means like boiling water. Do you know that feeling inside of you where things are unsettled? You know that point on the stove when you're watching the pot and it suddenly begins to actually boil and the bubbles come up and they're all random and they're all over the place, and well, you know what we mean, right? You know what it means to be troubled in heart. It's that feeling inside, that out of control bubbling. And Jesus turns to his disciples and he says, "Don't let your hearts be troubled." Now, we need to consider why Jesus would say that. Is it because there's nothing in this world to be troubled about? Is Jesus saying, look, the world is not as it seems, there's nothing wrong going on? Think about what they've been through. Jesus just dismissed Judas to betray him. Jesus is about to be crucified. He's not being foolish here. He's not saying, oh, that's not going to happen. There's nothing bad that happens. There absolutely is bad things that happen. Jesus is about to be crucified. And yet he still says to them, now that Judas is gone, come here close to me. He says, now, do not let your hearts be troubled. Jesus has already been troubled. If you've been paying attention in the book of John, back in John chapter 12, the Bible says that Jesus told his disciples, the crowd that was around him, he says, now is my soul troubled. And what shall I say? Father, save me from this hour, but for this purpose I've come to this hour. As Jesus was getting closer to the cross, there was a sense in which he was troubled. He was beginning to bear all the trouble of the world on himself. He was about to have the weight of sin crushing on him on the cross, and he was troubled about that. We saw in the last chapter, as we read together, that Jesus was troubled in his spirit when he had to tell his disciples one of them would betray him. Jesus was troubled. He was taking that on himself. He was now expressing to them that he would be troubled, but in an ultimate sense that they wouldn't have to be. Imagine that they had taken on the feelings of their teacher. For weeks now, the tension had been building. They could tell something was wrong. They were becoming more and more agitated. This night, Jesus had been troubled in his spirit. He had to tell them, one of you will betray me. And now they all have downcast faces. Now they're all worried. Now Jesus knows what's going on in their hearts, that they're in turmoil. But he says to them, okay, no, you don't have to do that anymore. I'm going to the cross now. You don't have to be troubled in there. Let not your hearts be troubled. Let's take a minute and let you know that it is possible to make an idol out of being troubled. I don't know if that applies to anybody here. I'm just saying that it is possible for us as Christians, though Jesus has told us don't let our hearts be troubled, to say, well, I'm not a good person unless I'm concerned about everything. That we have to walk around with this attitude of, well, you know, it's a sinful world and there's lots of trouble out there. And that's true. We're not lying and we say that. But we can begin to take on an attitude, well, if I'm not very concerned about all these things, then I'm not doing my duty. I'm not taking care of them. But Jesus takes care of them. Jesus is troubled about them. God cares about them. Now, if he didn't, then we would be in trouble. Then we would have something to worry about. But Jesus does care about those things. He's worrying about them for us. And we can honestly say, let not your hearts be troubled. In fact, there really is a practical parallel here with how Jesus deals with our sin and what he says to us about our hearts being troubled. The Bible tells us that on the cross, Jesus bore our sin, that he actually takes the sin that you and I deserve to be punished for. He took it on himself and was punished for it himself. And then when he rose from the dead, he can now give us his righteousness. There's an exchange that takes place. The Bible calls that imputed righteousness, that he gives righteousness to us. So that when God looks at us after salvation, he no longer sees our sin. That was given to Jesus, but now he sees the righteousness that Jesus gave to us. Jesus is saying something parallel here about trouble. He says, I have been troubled, I will bear the trouble. You give the trouble to me, and I will give you in exchange peace. He's the all-knowing one who bears our trouble, and he gives us his peace. In just a little while in this same chapter, Jesus is going to tell these disciples, I'm going to leave you with my peace. I don't give it to you like the world gives it to you. Let not your hearts be troubled, neither let them be afraid. I'm going to take your trouble. I'm going to give you my peace, Jesus says. Now, this isn't a promise that we'll never go through hard times. It's not meant to be understood that if you're troubled in heart, you must not be saved. That's not what Jesus is saying here. In fact, Jesus himself was very honest with his disciples. A little later in this conversation, in John chapter 16, Jesus tells them, I have said these things to you that in me you may have peace. In the world you will have tribulation, but take heart, I have overcome the world. Jesus uses two different words in these two different instances. When he says, let not your hearts be troubled, that's that agitation of heart, that boiling feeling in the heart. When he uses the word tribulation, that's a word that means like pressure. He says, look, the world is a pressure cooker, and that's going to happen. It's not going to go away. Once we become a Christian, I still live in a sinful world. I still experience the pains in the world, some of them that I began, some of them that are part of my problems, some of them are other people's problems that I just have to live through. Some of them are problems that have been going on in this world for years and years and years. There is a pressure cooker tribulation in this world, and I'm going to experience that. Jesus wasn't denying that we would go through those things. We don't close our eyes to them and say, well, I never have anything go wrong in my life. Of course we do. We understand that tribulation still exists. But Jesus said that we don't have to let that affliction cause us distress of heart. You understand the difference here between tribulation and trouble in your heart. Jesus says, in this world you will have tribulation. The pressure will come on, but you don't have to be troubled in your heart. That's what he's saying to us. In fact, not only do you not have to be, this is actually a command. I think we lose that a little bit with the word let. We usually use let as in giving permission, as in you can do it or you don't have to, whatever you want to do. I'll let you watch TV today. You say to your kids, you can do it if you want to, you don't have to. But here, it might be better to say, Jesus said, do not let your hearts be troubled. This was a command. He said to his disciples, do not let your hearts be troubled. And he says, believe in God, believe also in me. Think about that for a minute. The opposite of being troubled in your heart is believing that God does what he says. You think the opposite of being troubled in your heart is relaxing. That's what we're told. We are told that the opposite of being troubled in heart is just getting alone, getting quiet, being relaxed, maybe entertaining yourself. I've had a rough day. I'm really troubled in heart. I need to watch a movie and just turn this off. I need to relax. I'm under too much stress. Does that really work? It doesn't, right? It comes right back as soon as you're done. That's distraction. The opposite of being troubled in heart is believing in Jesus, believing that what he said is true. And that actually works. Then you can be in the pressure of tribulation and not be troubled in heart. Notice what Jesus says to give reassurance in a time of difficulty. He reassures us that he will do two things, that he will give us a home and that he will give us wholeness. There's two real main categories that Jesus launches into here when he says, let not your hearts be troubled. He then says, look, let me tell you why you don't need to be agitated inside. If you're a believer, if you believe in God, believe also in me, here's why you don't need to be all torn up on the inside. Now, these verses are some of the most comforting verses in the Bible. Years ago, Sarah and I were both in a class that we did at a church we used to go to in Orlando, and we had to memorize these verses, verses 2 and 3. And I'm not always good at memorizing stuff. Sometimes I kind of resent it at first. You're like, oh, I don't want to have to do these lessons. Memorizing these verses, some of the best things I ever done. I would encourage you to memorize verse 2 and 3, and you'll find that it comes back to you over and over and over. And I think Jesus intended that to be the case. Jesus' words of comfort meet two basic concerns that trouble us. And if I think this will come up for you, it certainly comes up for me. These are things that come up over and over and over. The first one is the question, will I ever really belong? Now, you may not phrase it that way. I don't want you to get hung up on the way that I ask it. You may not speak to yourself the way I talk to myself, but think about what I mean here. I think you have this same question. One of the deepest insecurities that all of us have is, do I really belong anywhere? I don't feel like I fit here. I don't feel like I fit in my family. I don't feel like I fit in this community. I'm not in the right place. I'm not in the right job. Sometimes at your darkest time, you might even have thought, I'm not even in the right life. Right? That's the beginning of suicidal thoughts, is I just don't belong. I don't even belong here, some people begin to think. And this is a question that all people have at one level or another. Do I really belong anywhere? Will I ever find a place where I says, this is where I really belong? And Jesus begins, he says, let not your hearts be troubled. Believe in God, believe also in me. And then he says, in my Father's house. Jesus had a basic understanding that there was a place he was going back to where he belonged. And he had been teaching his disciples, you belong there too. That's where you belong. That's where you will find the answer to, this is where I fit. I've never been totally sure that I was supposed to be where I was at. But Jesus says, in my Father's house, there's many rooms. There's a place for you. I don't know if you've ever gone on a trip, or maybe you had something more traumatic, like you were removed from a home, and if you've ever had a room set up for you. And it could be as simple as something where somebody else booked a hotel room for you, or it could have been something much more meaningful, like when you walked into a foster home and somebody had prepared a place for you. But do you remember that feeling where somebody says, oh, we have a room for you. We have a place for you. Jesus says to his disciples, in my Father's house are many rooms. There's a place for you. When you get there, that's where you belong. That's where you were made for. He even says, if it were not so, would I have told you that I go to prepare a place for you? He turns it back on us. He says, what, are you calling me a liar? He says, if it were not true, would I have been leading you on for these 3 years? One of the things that's interesting about this is it's hard to go back in the Gospels and find out the exact place where Jesus told them that he went to prepare a place for them. I'm not saying there isn't one, but it's actually so pervasive that it's not one verse, it's everywhere. It's not one place. It's from the very moment he called them, come follow me. There had been an underlying truth that Jesus is saying, what do you think, I wasn't for real? You didn't think that all this time I haven't been leading you to a certain place? I have a place for you where you belong. Jesus' reassurance, and you can come back to these verses over and over and over if you'll memorize them, that in my Father's house are many rooms. What do you think, I didn't actually prepare that for you? That's where you belong. Not only does he answer that question of you need a home, a place where you belong, the other question that I think everyone ends up asking in one way or another is something along the lines of, will I ever be well? What is wrong with me, and will it ever be right? Some people come to it at an early age, some people come to it much later in life through a lot of turmoil, but you start to realize, I'm not totally right. That doesn't mean you hate yourself. That doesn't mean it's total self-loathing that you're no good. But you realize better than anybody else, because you know yourself better than anybody else, that I'm not really right. There's something that's not quite right about me. And you begin to wonder, will I ever really be well? Jesus answered the question, will I ever belong? But what about the question, will I ever be well? And Jesus says, if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again. Everything that Jesus was teaching to his disciples was not going to culminate at this moment, but he said it is going to culminate. He said there's still a time, there is a fixed time in God's eternal schedule of events when everything will be made right. And Jesus now fixes that at his return. We call that the return of Christ today. But Jesus is the one who told us, look, there's going to come a time where I will come back. and I will make everything right at that time. He says, I will come again and receive you to myself. Jesus said that you and I will be together forever. The disciples had been with Jesus for 3 years, and they had learned that if they stayed with Jesus, everything would be okay. Whether it was the boat in the stormy sea, as long as Jesus was there, he could calm the sea. Whether it was the demoniac that comes running down from the hills, if they stayed with Jesus, he could cast the demons out. Whether it was the lack of food, if they stayed with Jesus, he could multiply the bread and the fish and feed everyone. If they would just stay with Jesus, everything would be well. And they were terrified that he might be going somewhere and leave them alone. And Jesus said, it's okay, I'm coming back. And when I come back, we're going to be together forever. Everything will be well then. He says that where I am, there you may be also. Now, Jesus is going to do something in this whole conversation, and it will get more explicit in chapter 16 and chapter 17 specifically when Jesus prays and the disciples overhear him praying to the Father. But Jesus is essentially going to do something. This is deep. We'll have to come back to it again. But I want you to think about it at least today. Jesus is going to tie our eternal destiny and health to the very nature of God himself. That Jesus is now saying, God and I cannot be separated. The Father and the Son are one. We cannot be separated. When you get saved, your salvation is that sure. You are now included in the relationship with the Father and the Son. It's fixed. It is sure. It cannot be undone. When your heart is troubled, you can remember that Jesus is coming back for you to take you home, to make you whole. That's what Christians are living by. You know, the Christian life is not just learning to do better things here, to live a better life. The Christian life begins with having a better hope and a future. That's what we live for. Now, there are a couple of objections to this, and maybe you have these. I don't know if those come up in your heart, but the disciples aren't easily comforted. Right? They're worried about stuff. They don't take comfort easily, and they have some objections to this reassurance by Jesus. The disciples aren't able to keep pace with the changing mood. Things have been getting harder and harder and harder, and Jesus even is worried. And now Jesus says, okay, now Judas is gone, the cross is sure, let not your hearts be troubled, and they can't shift gears fast enough. Like, whoa, we're still troubled, Jesus. Jesus is trying to give them reassurance, and they don't want to be comforted so easily. So 2 of the disciples speak up, and they're 2 that we don't hear from as much. Thomas is often called Doubting Thomas because after Jesus' resurrection, he demanded proof before he would believe that Jesus was raised from the dead. But at this point, Thomas has a question about our belonging or our home. He says, well, how can we know the way? And Jesus himself answers the questions of how. And I don't mean he answers the question, I mean he is the answer to the question. By the way, this is not a dumb question from Thomas. Sometimes we give Thomas a hard time in the Bible by calling him Doubting Thomas, but it's not a dumb question. Thomas is saying, look, how can we know the way? We don't even know where you're going. Now, why would Thomas say that? He says that because just if you look back just a little bit in chapter 13, verse 33, Jesus said, little children, yet a little while I am with you, you will seek me, and just as I said to the Jews, so now I also say to you, where I am going, you cannot come. Thomas is still hung up on that. So, Jesus, I thought you said that where you're going, we can't come. We don't even know where that is. I'm not so sure about this. How can we know the way to get there? But Jesus has changed tactics a little bit. Remember, when we read that verse before, we were clear that Jesus was saying, you cannot now come where I am going. And there's 2 levels of meaning there. He was saying to them, I'm going to go to heaven and you're not ready to do that yet. Now's not the time. He was also saying that he was going to go to the cross and now was not their time to suffer yet. Those disciples would end up suffering for Jesus, but now was not the time. They would not follow him there now. But Jesus is now changing topics. He's shifted to reassurance, and he's telling them, look, you know that I haven't been leading you on. When I called you to follow me, I've got a place for you. Thomas thought that they could not know where he was going, but Jesus was talking about the Father's house now. So he's saying, what is the way to get to that sense of belonging or home? And Jesus says, He is the way. Again, great verse to memorize. Jesus says so very clearly, I am the way and the truth and the life. That's powerful. He says, Thomas, I can take care of that for you. He doesn't say, I will show you the way. He said, I am the way. If you have me, you are on the way. If you have me, you do know the truth. If you have me, you do have life. And he follows that up by something that makes sense after saying that. No one comes to the Father except through me, Jesus says. That's a claim of exclusivity. But it's still a comforting claim. Sometimes the claim of exclusivity is necessary, right? Isn't that true in marriage? Isn't that what we mean by the vow? You know, our society says about romantic relationships that the greatest thing someone can say is, I love you. But at old times, it had an addendum to it. I love you and I don't love anyone else that way. That's a different kind of love, right? There has to be an exclusion to make it complete. That's why in the marriage vows, we say you take this person and don't take any others. It's not just that you love this person, but that you prove your love to this person by saying, I don't love anyone else in that way either. And Jesus completes this idea. I am the way and the truth and the life, and there is no other way. This is the only way. It's interesting, you know, Jesus' followers after his resurrection were called followers of the way because their life had been so totally changed. It's important because the way to heaven, and this is significant, and you might be confused about this, the way to heaven is not death. That would be a death cult. That's what so many other religions teach. The way to heaven is not death. The way to heaven is Jesus. That's not the same thing. Yes, we're going to die, but that's not the path to heaven. The path to heaven is Jesus. If you know Jesus, then you know the Father, and you belong. In fact, then the way is like a homing instinct that will lead you there. It's no longer a list. It's no longer a criteria. Do you do A and B and C and D? Instead, once you have Christ, the way is in you. You will follow that way until you get there. John, the apostle who's writing this account, would later write, this is the testimony, that God gave us eternal life, and this life is in his Son. Whoever has the Son has life. Whoever does not have the Son of God does not have life. The second objection to Jesus' reassurance here concerns the idea of wholeness. So Thomas wants to know, we don't know where we're going. How can we know the way? And Jesus says, look, I'm the way. If you know me, you'll make it home. You'll be where you belong. The second objection is about this idea of wholeness. When will I be well? Philip seems to need some sort of instantaneous proof. He's the one that is essentially saying, I could cope with all of this if only I knew blank. And I challenge you with that. I think many of us have been in a situation where in our prayer time, we've essentially gotten to a point where we said to God, but I could deal with this if only you would tell me this. Or if only I would know this. And it does not sound like it, but that's a demand, isn't it? Isn't that the same thing a toddler does when we say, look, I will only have a good attitude if you give me this toy, right? If you will do this thing, it's a sense of bargaining. And Philip here, though I'm not accusing him of being an evil person, I'm saying you and I do the same sort of thing. He says to Jesus, but look, I could be comforted. I would obey your command not to let my heart be troubled if only you would show us the Father. That if, and that sounds so simple. Yeah, I mean, that would prove it. I mean, if we could just see the Father now, I'd have no problem. That'd be easy. But he's essentially saying to Jesus, I won't obey you until you show me the Father. Then I'll consider obeying you. But Jesus doesn't give what Philip thinks he needs. Instead, he gives him hope. The Bible says hope does not disappoint. It says in Romans 5, because the love of God has been poured out on our hearts through the Holy Spirit who is given to us. Jesus himself answers the questions of hope. Again, he isn't saying that he just gives hope. He says that he is hope. Philip needed some sort of event or experience or moment to carry him through. But Jesus gives him something better, gives him himself. If we pin everything we need on some one event or experience or moment, then we always need another one, because that one fades. But Jesus gives us himself. He talks about the unity of the Father and the Son again. He says, whoever has seen me has seen the Father. Jesus said, look, don't you understand that I am giving you the picture of the Father you need? He goes on to talk about the authority of his words. He says, do you not believe that I am in the Father and the Father is in me? The words that I say to you, I do not speak on my own authority, but the Father who dwells in me does his works. He says, look, the words that I'm saying don't come from me. They come from the Father himself. You can count on those words. And he says, if you don't believe that I am in the Father and the Father is in me, at least believe on account of the works themselves. Philip and Thomas and the rest of the disciples had been with Jesus when they had seen Jesus calm the storm and raise the dead and heal the blind and cast out demons. They had seen the works that Jesus had done. And Jesus said, the only reason I did those was to show you that I am one with the Father. Our pastor used to say years ago a simple phrase that God is more concerned with your character than he is with your comfort. And I'm going to say something similar to you this morning that might be a little surprising at first, but God's main objective is not to do miracles here. Even when Jesus did miracles, he tells his disciples at this point, look, you saw all the miracles I did, and the only purpose of those miracles was to show you that I am in the Father and the Father is in me. It's to prove who I was. His main goal isn't just to do the miracles. The miracles are there to show you who he is, who he claims to be. We get hung up on the miracles, and then the miracles are never enough. The disciples had seen that. I would guess, I don't know this, I won't say exactly what you've thought, but I would guess that you have thought at some point, if I had seen Jesus heal that blind man, I'd believe in him easy. I would never have any other troubles. If I had seen Jesus raise Lazarus from the dead, well, I would never be in a time of doubting. But the disciples did, and Jesus is now having to say to them, haven't you seen the things that I've done, and yet you still don't believe that I am in the Father and the Father is in me? Sometimes God does that with us, where we have already forgotten the time that he healed me from a cold. And we've walked right away from it, and we're at some later point refusing to let not our hearts be troubled. And we're saying, oh, well, if only God, you could do what I need now, then I wouldn't have any troubles. And God is saying, haven't you remembered the time I healed you from a cold and provide for you financially in this instance and protected your children in this instance? You don't need more proof. That's not going to do it. It doesn't mean he won't answer your prayer. I don't know whether he will or not. God has his own purposes and when he answers those for us and when he doesn't. But he often brings us back to the times he has answered to say, look, you have all the proof you need if you only believe it. But Jesus is telling us that we will be made whole like the Father has communion with the Son and the Son with the Father. He's saying, Philip, do you really believe that I am in the Father and the Father is me? Do you really believe what I've been telling you about me being the Savior? As sure as that is true, you will be made well if you trust in me. Let me put it to you even this way this morning, that God is not only glorified in the perfect you, He's also glorified in perfecting you. Does that make sense? Sometimes we think that God is only going to be happy with us when we're all well at the end. He will be happy with us there. But He is happy with us as we are being perfected also. God loves to see you becoming whole. We don't like the process as much. We think it would be better if we were just whole now. We would say, snap our fingers, God, everything's better now. But God likes to see you getting well, being made whole. He's not left you here on accident saying, I'm just going to withhold. I'm going to make you wait with some of your troubles for a time for some sort of reason, capricious reasons of His own because He doesn't like you or because He thinks He needs to teach you a lesson. No, He's doing that because He gets glory from seeing you be made whole. In fact, in the book of Hebrews, we're told about this. It said, since we're surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely. Let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith. And this is important. Remember what the disciples are going through at this time. Jesus is right about to go to the cross, who for the joy that was set before Him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of God. The book of Hebrews tells us that Jesus endured the cross because of the joy that was set before Him. In other words, that He began to see the suffering of the cross as a perfecting work which must be accomplished. And God changes the opinions that we have about our own life to tell us, now that you're a believer, the rest of what's going to happen in your life will bring me glory. That it will be for the joy set before you that you will go through this, that you will be changed into who I want you to be. And the writer of Hebrews says, consider Him who endured from sinners such hostility against Himself, so that you may not grow weary or faint-hearted. So how do we not let our hearts be troubled? How do we not grow weary or faint-hearted? We look to Jesus, who was troubled for us. That Jesus took our trouble so we don't have to be troubled in heart. You will still have times when you are under the pressure. Still have times when you are under tribulation. You'll have difficulty. But we don't have to be troubled in heart. In fact, Jesus said, do not be troubled in heart. Why don't we have to be troubled in heart? Because Jesus has answered those two deep needs that we have. He has provided for us a home, a place where we really belong. He's provided for us wholeness, where we will be totally well.